Ironically, it was the Kempe Tai who actually saved Lieutenant Hap Halloran's life. As Halloran drifted closer to the ground, he could see the angry, upturned faces of local Japanese civilians and hear their excited screams. He could also see the many weapons they carried in their hands. I felt helpless and feared the worst. I hit very hard in a strong wind, recalled Halloran. The civilians followed the flow of my chute. They were extremely hostile and beat me with clubs, rods, rocks, and many other objects. I blacked out from the beatings. I felt I would die that afternoon on enemy soil. As soon as it was reported by Japanese air defenses that enemy planes had been shot down and crewmen had been observed bailing out, Kempe Tai's squads were sent out in any available transport to track the white parachutes as they came to Earth and capture the airmen before enraged civilians killed them. Halloran was lucky, for a group of Kempe Tai soldiers quickly arrived on the scene and wedged themselves between the prone Halloran and the mob, ordering them back. The Kempe Tai knew the value of enemy airmen and the military intelligence they could torture out of them before they were court-martialed and executed or imprisoned under the instructions of the 13th of August 1942. For some Americans, the Kempe Tai arrived just in the nick of time as they were only seconds away from death. Lieutenant Delbert W. Miller of the 40th Bombardment Group was shot down on the 26th of May 1945 over Tokyo. Shortly after he landed, a group of Japanese civilians had beaten him and thrown a rope noose around his neck and were about to lynch him from the nearest lamppost when the Kempe Tai intervened. Colonel Richard King was not beaten by the crowd of civilians who captured him, but instead they marched him to the local police station, where I waited for 2 hours until 2 Japanese soldiers came to pick me up, he said. King and another downed airman, Colonel Byron Brugge from Wing Headquarters, were blindfolded, loaded onto a truck, and driven into central Tokyo. I was tied and thrown into a coal truck and taken to a briefing room at a fighter base where the beatings continued, recalled Lieutenant Halloran. He was then transferred to a Kempe Tai prison close to the Imperial Palace, where he was extensively maltreated. They wanted to know all about the B-29 aircraft, said Halloran. It was a charade. One day they showed me a large blueprint of the aircraft, and I found out that they knew more about the technical aspects of the plane than I did. All bomber crews flying missions over Japan had been told to cooperate with the Japanese if they fell into enemy hands. Halloran and his crew were briefed 1 week before their final mission by a U.S. Marine Corps officer from Washington, D.C., who instructed them to forget earlier briefings regarding capture and interrogation and tell them answers to all questions, as the standard name, rank, and serial number routine only resulted in instant death when captured. The Japanese wanted to know all about Saipan, the island base the Americans used to launch B-29 raids on Japan. Saipan had a large Japanese population and had been captured after fierce fighting with Japanese forces. They would grill me about Saipan, said Halloran. How many Japanese prisoners were held there? I told them I didn't know the difference between a Japanese and an islander. That was the wrong answer, and I would be knocked down again. I would tell them that I didn't see any Japanese after being accused of killing Japanese as they tried to surrender when the island fell in 1944. With that answer, I would be hit again. Well, maybe I saw a few, I would say, and then they would beat the hell out of me and say that their people would never surrender. It was a no-win situation. Colonel King had been subjected to a similar interrogation to Halloran several weeks before. The Japanese demanded his name, rank, and serial number, which he gave, as this was not in contravention of the Geneva Convention. However, they went on to request our home addresses and other information. When I asked why they wanted this information, they said they needed it so they could notify our families. This, of course, was never done. King was stripped, but some of his clothing was later returned to him. He was then subjected to a severe interrogation, as he put it, concerning Saipan. When I answered many of their questions truthfully that I did not know, they attempted to force me to answer by slapping my face and other minor abuse. Lieutenant Halloran spent 67 days in Kempe Tai custody, where he was kept in a horse stall in solitary confinement, was interrogated and beaten virtually every day, and was offered no medical treatment for his injuries. The last 2 days were truly bizarre. The Japanese took some American flyers to Ueno Zoo in Tokyo, where the men were stripped naked and in their filthy, bruised and bearded state placed into animal cages and displayed to the public. Members of the public filed past the cages, laughing and jeering at the prisoners. Even at the height of the firebombing campaign against German cities and industry in 1944-45, downed British and American aircrew were usually accorded prisoner of war status and treated well. There were cases where enraged mobs beat Allied airmen to death soon after they landed by parachute or strung them up from the nearest lamppost. But there was never this level of sadistic cruelty and denigration officially organized by the German authorities. Aircrew prisoners fell under the jurisdiction of the Luftwaffe, not the Gestapo, and they were treated as fellow professional airmen by their captors. One could only imagine the outcry among the British if the government had ordered downed Luftwaffe airmen to be publicly exhibited naked in cages at Regent's Park Zoo, even at the height of the Blitz. When Hap Halloran arrived at Omori Camp on the 1st of April 1945, he discovered 31 other flyers, including 5 members of the crew of the Rover Boys Express. By far the most prominent prisoner held at Omori was 33-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Gregory Pappy Boyington, a Sioux Indian and a decorated Marine Corps fighter ace with 26 confirmed aerial victories to his name. Boyington was one of the famous Flying Tigers, the American volunteer group that flew combat missions against the Japanese in China before the Pacific War began, and later commanded Marine Corps Squadron VMF 211, famously called the Black Sheep Squadron. Boyington had been shot down over Rabaul in New Britain during a massive dogfight with Japanese aircraft on the 3rd of January 1944, during which he had personally dispatched 3 enemy fighters. He bailed out into the sea and was picked up by a Japanese submarine and taken prisoner. Immediately after the war, Boyington was awarded the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross by President Truman. Halloran got to know Boyington well during their imprisonment together, recalling that he had maintained a sparkle in his eyes and the look and mannerisms of a natural leader. Boyington was tough. He instilled confidence in us in a quiet way, and I knew I would be okay as long as Pappy was there. Even the Japanese were impressed to have such a famous prisoner. Boyington would give the Japanese guards demonstrations, the number of Japanese planes he had shot down. Strangely, most of his guards respected and sometimes applauded him. The end of the war in the Far East brought only more death to captive Allied aircrew. The city of Hiroshima was strictly off-limits for Allied bombers, even as a secondary target, because the Americans wanted it preserved intact to test the effectiveness of the atomic bomb against a fully populated and pristine Japanese city. Hiroshima was a major military base, the stated reason for its destruction by the Americans, and because it was one of the last major cities undamaged by the B-29 raids, its Kempeitai unit was fully operational and based at Hiroshima Castle. On the 28th of July 1945, a group of American B-24 liberators had attacked the huge Japanese naval base at Kure with the aim of damaging or sinking the battleship Haruna at anchor in the harbor. Passing over Mount Futaba, the American aircraft drew considerable anti-aircraft fire and planes were hit. Ironically, although the bombers successfully sank the Haruna, the battleship's fuel tanks had been pumped dry, so the ship was already immobilized before the attack. The first B-24 to go down was nicknamed Taloa. Very few of the crew got clear of the stricken aircraft. A second plane was hit, but was able to fly to an island short of Okinawa, recalled Second Lieutenant Thomas Cartwright, piloting Lonesome Lady. Suddenly, Cartwright's plane was struck by flak and badly damaged. I did not realize how badly we were damaged and planned to head for the open sea, where there was hope that our naval seaplanes would spot us and pick us up if we ditched and survived, wrote Cartwright. We started losing altitude and the controls became less responsive, and I could not head out to sea. The plane flew back towards land on its own. With one engine on fire, Cartwright ordered his crew to jump for it. One crewman perished when his parachute failed to open, but the other 7 made it safely to the ground, finding themselves spread out over several miles. All but one of the American flyers was quickly picked up by the local Kempei Tai, though a Japanese civilian was shot dead by two of the Americans when he approached them with a rifle. The Americans were taken to Chugoku Military Police Headquarters in Hiroshima and roughly interrogated. At this stage of the war, American airmen were instructed to cooperate fully with their captors, in the hope of saving their lives, as the war appeared to be almost over. The Kempei Tai did not believe most of what the airmen told them and continued to beat and torture them for information. In total, the Kempei Tai picked up 15 Americans from Taloa and Lonesome Lady. The Kempei Tai dispersed these men into individual cells at 3 locations around Hiroshima. On the morning of the 6th of August, 2 silver B-29 Superfortress bombers appeared above the untouched city of Hiroshima. One carried an atomic bomb, the other cameras to film what followed. At 8:16 a.m., nuclear destruction flattened most of Hiroshima, killing around 140,000 people. Most of the Americans in the city, including 2 U.S. Navy flyers, were vaporized. Evidence suggests that some survived the initial blast, only to be murdered by vengeful Kempei Tai officers and local civilians. 2 were probably dragged from their cells at Hiroshima Castle and clubbed to death in the grounds by the furious Kempei Tai, while 2 others were tied to lampposts in the devastated city and stoned to death by mobs of disbelieving civilians. Lieutenant Cartwright survived and was taken to Tokyo for further interrogation about the new American wonder weapon, while tail gunner Wilbur Abel had managed to hide in the hills around Hiroshima when he had first landed by parachute, and had thus avoided capture. The day after the atomic bombing, Abel gave himself up. The Kempei Tai tortured him badly, but he did manage to survive the war along with Cartwright, one of only a handful of American airmen captured by the Kempei Tai who did. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe and share, and also visit my video channel, Mark Felton Productions. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon, details in the description box below.